This is very important before I say anything. I don't know anything, so don't trust me on anything I say now. I've been asked to do this because I do radio shows about science. I love science, but as I've always said at the beginning of any show that I've done, if I say anything that in any way interests you or excites you, before you tell any of your friends, Google it first. There is a high percentage chance I've misunderstood. One of the interesting things Nick was saying there is about evidence, where we currently seem to live in an age of opinion, where if you hold an opinion, that is worth as much as anyone else. There's a wonderful writer, a very angry writer called Harlan Ellison, and he once said something which I think was wonderful. He said, you don't have the right to your opinion, you have the right to your informed opinion. No one has the right to be ignorant. Now, we live in this age where currently, whether it's New Age, whether it's looking at Big Pharma, many of the different ideas where people will go, well, I must be right, because I found 9 other people on the internet who agree with me, therefore I'm right. That's it. Someone the other day I was arguing with, who's actually a journalist, a paid journalist, said, if science is so good, then why do they have to keep changing it? And for me that was delightful, because, and infuriating as well, to see that we can live in an age where people think, why don't we just have dogma? You know, to have something, one of the most important tools of science, of evidence-based knowledge is, we are not necessarily on a journey to being 100% right. That may well be impossible, but we're on a constant journey to be less wrong. And people will sometimes say things like, they'll go, well, someone else, they said, science hasn't really got that far. They still don't know how the universe began. I said, well, they seem to have got to about 10 to the minus 37th of a second, which isn't bad. Yeah, I mean, there's still a lot of work going on, but we've covered a lot, but you know, they haven't stopped now. And he went, well, you see, because they haven't got an answer, I think I'm as right with my idea. And I tried to explain to this man, I said, there are different levels of wrong. Wrong is not just, once you're wrong, it's not just wrong is wrong. If one of you gets stung by a wasp, and a friend of yours says, do you know what you need to do if you're stung by a wasp? Pour a bit of milk on your hand, that gets rid of the stingy feeling. And your other friend turns to you and goes, no! You need to cut off your hand immediately before the wasp demon takes over your mind. Both of those answers are wrong, but one, I think, is less wrong than the other. Once it comes to limb loss, that's where it changes. And with medicine, it's again, there's this fear of, well, not a fear, there's a kind of experts are no longer. I read a book recently, well, I read the first page and then I threw it away. And I'll explain why. It was a book called The Secret History of the World, and it's one of those books that explained about Atlantis and all of it, you know, why aliens have visited 5,000 years ago to give us knowledge and civilization, and it didn't have many footnotes or references. And at the beginning it said, this is a rude gesture to the know-it-alls, the intellectual elite, and the so-called experts. Now, there are so-called experts, and there are experts. If you say, for instance, I'm an expert on romance, that's probably a so-called expert. If you say that you're a reasonable expert on particle physics, or perhaps pottery, evidence will be required to show that, in fact, yes, this is an area you know more about than most. But, so this idea where, if you say, for instance, oh, my car's broken down. Well, you can take it to a mechanic. No. That is the last person I would take my car to. What with their mechanic's way of thinking and their mechanic's philosophy. I don't want to put my car into the hands of the mechanics. Oh no. Well, who are you going to take it to? I take my car to a homeopath. They're very good. My car overheated last week, and the homeopath gave me some water that had the memory of cooling. It was perfect. So we have this, in fact, one of my first, sorry, I'm going to introduce the people who are actually doing the lecture, but it is doing a Radio 4 show, the constant battle we have. Someone said to me recently about, it was an intelligent design proponent. And they said, isn't it good that intelligent design proponents exist? Because it means they ask scientists questions. I said, scientists don't just not do anything until a creationist turns up. They don't just kind of sit down, Darwin's covered it, we should be fine. We just say, that's why the camel's like it is. Uh-oh, here come the creationists, we'll have to come up with more answers. It didn't end there. And I think that is, one of the important things where, I then said to the guy, I said, do you think Holocaust denialists, do you think they're important for history? And he said, yes, I do. And that's where we ended our conversation. So, but I do have two people who I'm going to introduce who, the first speaker is someone who has just flown around the world, and and they got back from the USA this morning, I think. They've since been to a select committee. I was looking at his CV, which is 14 pages long. It is, if I just go through a few, 259 articles in peer-reviewed journals. If I actually read out all the articles, just their titles, that would take longer than the hour we have here. They have been pathogenesis of fever in rectal carcinoma, the case for generic substitution, anabolic steroids, the power and the glory, question mark, should idiosyncrasy be defined as equivalent to type B adverse drug reactions. He's been the author and editor of 12 books. He has written chapters for 61 further books. And I've been looking at 6, this is probably wrong now. I'm going to say 6 honorary fellowships. Since I looked that up this morning, I imagine it's now 7 or 8. The Galen Medal from the Society of Apothecaries. It is, in fact, by the way, I lied, it's a 24-page CV. Mine still doesn't quite get to a page. He is also, President of the Royal Society of Medicine, Chairman, as has been mentioned already by Nick, of National Institute for Health and Clinical Excellence, and I'm going to be fascinated to see where he takes us with it. What was wonderful about this is when I asked before, and I said, so what are the two people talking about? And everyone organised went, we don't know. So it's an exciting evening, and there will be afterwards a chance for you to ask questions as well to both speakers. I will introduce the second speaker in 20 minutes or so. So please welcome to this podium Sir Michael Rawlins.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. I was asked to speak, I was asked to do a debate on top-down or bottom-up. And so what I'm going to talk about really is the extent to which basic science and clinical science interrelate in therapeutics. Whether the basis for the use of therapeutic interventions can or should be based on evidence derived from basic sciences, bottom-up, or clinical studies in patients, top-down. Now, conventional wisdom holds nowadays that basic science is necessary, even essential, for identifying druggable targets and for demonstrating in vivo and in vitro a potential for a positive therapeutic action. There is some truth in this, but for many drugs, in long-standing use and in unquestionable effectiveness, the mechanism of action remains opaque. For example, paracetamol, which I'm sure everyone here takes. We don't really know why it reduces pain or lowers fever. There is argument still about whether it works via the brain or by peripherally, probably both, probably peripheral for the pain and centrally for the fever, but we don't really know. Some people think it might be something to do with COX-3, but we don't know. Beta blockers and thiazide diuretics, widely used in the treatment of hypertension. Don't really know why they do it. And tricyclic antidepressants and SSRIs used extensively for the treatment of depression. I don't really know why they're effective. I don't know why it takes a month for them to work. I don't really understand. For other drugs, their discovery of their therapeutic effects has been accidental. For example, thiazide diuretics again, as antihypertensive agents, an entirely accidental discovery. Recently, rituximab was introduced 7 or 8 years ago for the treatment of chronic leukemia. A patient with chronic leukemia who also had rheumatoid arthritis turned up at a rheumatologist, and her rheumatoid arthritis had suddenly got incredibly better. And it turned out, of course, that rituximab is useful in rheumatoid arthritis. In fact, it's also been now shown to be effective in the treatment of pemphigoid. And sometimes the target is wrong. For example, even though it's effective, bromides were introduced 150 years ago because epilepsy was thought to be due to masturbation. Bromides in those days were thought to be useful for the treatment of masturbation or the prevention of self-abuse. In fact, allegedly the army have been giving bromides to soldiers ever since on the basis that it would reduce their sexual desires. So bromides would reduce desire for masturbation, would therefore cure epilepsy. Well, didn't cure epilepsy, but actually bromides were effective in the treatment of epilepsy. We know that. Methyl dopa for hypertension was introduced for entirely the wrong reason. And more recently, Viagra, we're back to sex again. Viagra was introduced or developed as a treatment for angina. It was given to some volunteers and they got a rather unexpected side effect. The interesting thing about that is that this volunteer study was done in Wales. And in order for Viagra to have its effect, there needs to be some sort of stimulation. There's been a lot of talk about what was the stimulation in the laboratory where these studies were being done. And I'm told it was, look out at the sheet, boy, look out at the sheet. Sometimes there are what you might call off-target effects, despite in vivo and in vitro screening, giving rise to adverse effects. Glitazones are known to cause adverse cardiovascular effects. COX-2 inhibitors also cause adverse cardiovascular effects. None of these predicted beforehand. The anorexic agent rimonabant was removed quite recently because it caused depression. The SSRIs, although they are effective in adult depression, actually cause suicidal ideation in children and adolescents. Not something you could ever discover until you started using them in man. And immunological reactions, particularly of the liver and the skin, rashes, Stevens-Johnson syndrome, toxic epidermal necrolysis. These sort of things never appear in animals. Animals have a rather different immunological system, and you never spot these sort of things. So, in summary, basic sciences are necessary, but not a sufficient basis for the use of therapeutic interventions. What, then, of clinical studies? Studies in man are traditionally based on three phases: phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 clinical trials. There's apparently a logical linear progression that represents a tried and tested approach that has been now being used for 50 years or more. But I think it's probably unsustainable in the future. Clinical trials and clinical research more generally has become increasingly costly. As a consequence, new drugs at the time they appear on the market, there's an increasing tendency for them to be unaffordable. The acquisition costs of new cancer drugs, for example, has increased 40-fold, taking account of the effects of inflation over the past 30 years. And because of their increased costs, most new drugs are completely unaffordable for 7/8 of the world. We are developing new drugs nowadays for only 1 billion people. The other 7 billion will not possibly be able to afford them. We need to re-examine the paradigm by which new drugs are developed and introduce leaner methods. For lean drug development, what we need to know when a drug is introduced to the market is 4 things. What's the magnitude of the effect at its licensed dose and indication? How much better or worse is it when compared to current standard practice? What's the balance between the benefits and the risks? And what's the balance between its benefits and its costs? I believe that at least one approach for us to adopt is to develop what's being called adaptive licensing, again involving 3 phases, but with a difference. Phase 1, as at present, studies in either patients or volunteers, and it depends on the circumstances which, to confirm its pharmacology in human beings, to identify what is likely to be an appropriate dose, and to identify unacceptable side effects. And sometimes these side effects may appear trivial, but are very important. There was a company many years ago now that developed a new treatment for, or thought it was developing a new treatment for hay fever. They popped it into animals, and it didn't seem to do much harm. And the experimental model suggested it would do some good. They gave it to the first volunteer, and they sneezed. A new drug for hay fever that makes you sneeze, completely useless, and it's gone straight away. So it's important, even these relatively modest adverse effects. Phase 2, again at present, studies in a target population designed to provide a preliminary assessment of a drug's efficacy and safety, and to provide some indication of the magnitude of the benefits it produces. And then what's conventionally called phase 3, here we should depart from conventional strategies. Make the drug available after phase 2 in a wide patient population, in a formal observational study, not a randomized controlled trial, and at least the manufacturer recoup some of its R&D costs. The purpose of this stage would be to assess the extent to which the product achieves its initial promise, not in the setting of a randomized controlled trial, but observationally in a real-world setting. To achieve this, there would need to be two caveats. First, the drug would need to be used strictly within the terms of its conditional adaptive license, no indication creep. Secondly, the fate of patients would need to be carefully documented, and this would be greatly facilitated if only we could have electronic medical records, not just in primary care, but also in secondary care too. And thirdly, some agreement would need to be reached between payers, the National Health Service in Britain, and the manufacturer about reimbursement, including what to do if the drug's promise was unfulfilled, as what to do as if it was overfilled. Adaptive licensing won't solve all our problems, but it would go a long way to use the unsustainable, to counteract the unsustainable costs of drug development for anti-cancer drugs, as well as those in many other therapeutic categories. And the subject of this discussion then, top-down or bottom-up, we need both approaches. Bottom-up to discover new targets, top-down to confirm the predictions of basic science. As I've already said, basic science is necessary but insufficient basis for using drugs in man. Put another way, the appropriate way of studying man is man. Thank you very much.